When it comes to polynomials, we have done adding and subtracting and multiplying. That's what the last pages were on. So now we're going to talk about factoring, which is a way of dividing. There is a type of dividing that we're going to do, but we're going to break it down into factoring first because there's a lot of factoring that we're going to do all year long. So this is where we're going to start, okay? I do want to talk about the different vocabulary because we are going to talk about what does it look like when we start with monomials or binomials or whatever. So the vocabulary is pretty key compared to some of the other vocabulary we've done. So let me scroll that down. All right, let's see what we've got. Okay. All right, so monomial, okay, if you think about it, mono means one, okay? So when we hear the phrase monomial, we are talking about one term. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple. There's a pretty long definition from your textbook, but it is really just one term. Okay? And a term, I'll put that kind of in parentheses, a term is a product of numbers and or variables. Okay? So it's just one group of either a number or variables or both, okay? So binomial, that is, bi we know means two, so that's just two terms. Okay, a polynomial with two terms, and so they're separated by addition and subtraction. By a plus or a minus, okay? And then trinomial we know means three, so that's three terms. All right, and so we're gonna talk about those. You're gonna get really familiar, but just know mono means one, binomial is two, trinomial is three. Okay, and then anything after three is just a polynomial. It's just many terms. So if we've got four or more terms, we just call it a polynomial. Okay, so a quadratic equation. We are going to talk about it this unit, but we're not going to look at it during this lesson, but we'll get it down anyway. An equation in one variable usually that variable is an x. We normally have x's in our quadratic equations. That can be written as ax squared plus bx plus c equals a 0. Okay? So this is a quadratic equation. It's got an x squared, it's got an x, and then it equals 0, and that's what we're going to be practicing a lot when we solve these things in a few lessons, okay? Roots and zeros of equations, we're going to talk about those when we get more into solving, so let's just take a break from the roots and the zeros. So as you go down on those definitions, we'll just cross through those for now, and we'll come back to what those mean. So again, right here, alright, so right here, you can just cross out roots and zeros for now. Okay, we are going to talk about those. They're really, really key to Algebra 2, but just not this lesson. So I want to go ahead and just jump into the actual work that we're going to do. All right, so we are going to factor. There are two there are 2 pages to this. One is a flow chart. I made it last year to help students organize their thoughts into how to approach the problem and where to go. So I am going to refer back to that flow chart, but we are going to talk about the first 2 types of factoring. And they have made it like this. I actually kind of like the box. I organize myself a little different, so I'm going to write it over here so you can see how I think about it. My students last year really liked the setup. So, okay, this is what I would call a basic trinomial, okay? Okay, it is a basic trinomial because it starts with an x. Okay, it's leading with just an x squared, so that's basic. You start off right with that variable x squared, so it's a very, very quick process, okay? The way you break down factoring trinomials is the numbers, they kind of have it here. The 2 numbers here, they have to multiply to one of them and they have to add to the other one, okay? So what I do is I go off to the side and I make an X. And like if you ask any of my students last year, they always use the X. They still use the X if they can, okay? And what we always do is we always multiply to the last, and we always add to the middle. Okay, so that says multiply and that says add. So when I set up my X, I put the multiplication number here, and I put the addition term down here. Okay? And again, and I didn't point this out before, trinomial 3 terms, so it's 1, 2, 3 terms, just to connect it to that vocabulary. All right, so it's whatever multiplies to -8 and whatever adds to a +7, okay? And you really don't need the x in this case. We're going to get to advanced trinomials instead of basic, where you are going to need the variables. In this case, you really don't need the variables. All you care about are the numbers, the coefficients. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, what 2 numbers multiply, and it's right here, and times n, which means the 2 back numbers, multiply to -8, and what 2 numbers add to a 7, okay? And I don't do this whole table and chart thing. I just use the x. And I just say, okay, well, one pair of numbers that multiply to -8 are -2 and 4. They're factor pairs. That's why we've been practicing factor pairs. So -2 and 4 are a factor pair, but when you add them, you don't get a 7, okay? Well, there's only 2 other numbers that multiply to 8. That would be 1 and -8. Okay, 1 and -8, they multiply to -8, but if you add them, you don't get a 7, you get a -7. So if you get the right number but the wrong sign, we just switch the signs, okay? That means it must be a +8 and -1, because -1 times +8 does multiply to -8, and -1 plus 8 is a +7. So these are the 2 numbers that work in this x that we've done, okay? They're the 2 numbers that multiply to the right thing and add to the right thing. And we got them from this trinomial, okay? So instead of doing all of this part, all of this table, and it's just going through all the pairs and are they adding and all that kinds of stuff, just going through the pairs here until they both match, then you've actually got your answer. So let me scroll this just a little bit. Okay, so you don't really, you could fill this out if you wanted. I'm not going to. Okay, I've actually got my answer straight from this x. So m is -1 and n is 8. So the factors are x minus 1, because that's what the -1 means, and x plus 8, because that's what the +8 means. So this is the factor. Once you find your numbers, you've got your factors, and we wrote them as 2 binomials. okay? Two pairs of two terms. So that's a binomial, x minus 1, and this is a binomial, x plus 8. Okay, so that's the start of our factoring, where if you start with a trinomial, 3 terms, it breaks down to binomials, and that's the most basic way that it'll break down. So let's practice it. Oh, okay, so let's also talk about one pattern. I don't do all these patterns. I think some of them are more complicated than others. So just like in multiplying, I don't always do patterns. Here I don't do it either. All right. Oops. Okay, so let me get here. The only pattern I actually go through and practice is this first one, is the difference of two squares. Okay? I don't worry about these two. If you read your textbook, or if you have a friend show you, or you've got a tutor, and you learn them, that's fine with me. But I actually don't teach them. I just go through and just kind of do it the old-fashioned way, like I just showed you, with making the X and then going from there, okay? But I do the difference of two squares, and all that means is if the front number is a perfect square and the back number is a perfect square, and we are subtracting right here, then you can just break it down into the square root of the front one and the square root of the back one. So, for example, a squared is just a times a, and b squared is just b times b. And then to get a negative b squared, one's positive, one's negative. Okay? So this is the example of it. X squared is just x times x. 4 is just 2 times 2. That's a perfect square. And then to get a negative 4, it's a positive 2 and a negative 2. Okay? So I do teach that pattern. This is a binomial. So if you're given a binomial, this is one of our patterns. We're going to have another set of patterns with binomials, but this gives us one part. So we're about to fill in our flow chart in a second, okay? So again, I skipped those, so let's go through and let's practice those two. All right, so let me get this out of the way. Okay, so it says factor it. So if you look closely, what do we have here? We have a binomial. So since this is a binomial, because there's only two terms, x squared and 25, two terms, then the only binomial that we talked about was that pattern up above. So what times what? I wouldn't worry about this. What times what gives you x squared? That's x times x. What times what gives you 25? That's 5 times 5. And that's because 25 can square root. It's a perfect square. And then a negative 25 would be a positive and a negative. Okay? All right, this one is one of the other patterns. Oh, actually, but instead of worrying about the pattern, what we can do is we can just treat this like a basic trinomial. Okay? So I'm going to do my x. All right, remember we multiply to the last number. So we're going to multiply to 121. And then we add to the middle number. And I only need the number for now. So we're going to, what number adds to negative 22. Okay? So the longest part about this is actually finding the pairs. And you can't, no one can do it for you. You got to use your calculator. And that's why we've been listing factor pairs, factor pairs, factor pairs, factor pairs. Because then you're just more comfortable in finding all of your options. In this case, 121 does not divide by much. It only divides by 11 times 11. Okay? But 11 plus 11 is a positive 22. And again, remember I said if your numbers are right but your sign is wrong, if this is negative 22, change both of their signs. Negative 11 times negative 11 is 121. but negative 11 plus negative 11 is negative 22. So those are the two numbers. And instead of, we could write it like this, it would be m in this case. M minus 11, because that's the first one. And then m minus 11, because that's the second one. Okay, you could actually condense it since there's two of those. It's just m minus 11 squared. Okay, so if you write it that way, I will not count it wrong. If you write it that way, I will not count it wrong. Final answers a lot of times are written like this. So either one is accurate. So this is the way that the textbook did it. So we'll put our cloud around that, okay? All right, so now let's just practice these two one more time with the x or the pattern, and then we're going to relate it to our flow chart. All right. So again, you want to ask yourself, what am I given? Okay, right now we only have two options. We either have a trinomial or a binomial. In this case, this is our trinomial. And in this case, this is our binomial. Now we're going to be given other types as we go. So that's why we've got the flow chart. But with our trinomial, we make our x. Okay, we want to multiply to the last number, so that's a positive 12. What multiplies to positive 12. And we want to add to the middle number. So what adds to a positive 7? There aren't too many options, 1 and 12. 1 and 12, but those add to 13, so that's wrong. Then you could go down the list, 2 and 6. They multiply to 12, but 2 plus 6 is 8, so that's not quite right. And then the last pair is 3 and 4. So this is a factor pair. They multiply to 12, but they add to 7, so those work. So that's what we want. So our factors are x plus 3 because it was positive, and x plus 4 because it's positive. Okay? So, and then here, that's a binomial. So in the binomial, we just ask ourselves, this is a pattern. What times what gives you x squared? That's x times x. And what times what gives you 81? We'll square root it, and it'll give you 9 times 9, because that's a perfect square. And then we want a negative 81, so it's a plus 9 and a minus 9. Okay? So those are pretty quick. So, okay, you can cross this out. We're not going to do this part yet. We're going to come back to that. So we're actually done on those pages. So now I want you to go through and I want you to fill out your factor flow chart, okay?